Hey there, welcome to this lecture. Today in this lecture, we're going to write all of the business logic and application modules. So where we will cover plenty of important topics right here. So first of all, let's try to clean it up all of the codes that is we wrote in our previous lecture, right? So let's try to clean it up. So at least we can have a clean code base. This one is not required because anyway, we're going to implement this event-driven the programming in our one of the lecture where we are going to cover our Elasticsearch. So right now our application is clean, and if you see in the project structure, you can see we have created plenty of directories. So why these directories are needed, right? So why we have just created a project structure or something like this, right? So this structure is, you can say, solid structure for monolithic application. Even each and every directory is responsible for a single layer, right? So that means we are using all of the layered architecture. You can see we have one API layer where we can consider routes. And we have a kind of controller, which is going to potentially handle all of the HTTP requests and responses. And we have our service layer also, where we are going to write all of the business logic. And we have a data access layer, where we are going to write all of the database related codes right there. With the help of this structure, we are following layered architecture, which is going to be clean separations between routes, controller, service, and repositories. And this is really scalable, easy to add new features. Just if you are right now, we're going to cover our user module here. So tomorrow maybe you are going to introduce some different module. Then you just need to create one service file inside this one, and routes also you can just create that way. And similar you can follow for controller also. So which is potentially going to give you a kind of better flexibility for breaking down this whole monolithic application to a different architecture, right? You can follow maybe microservice architecture, maybe event-driven, or maybe some similar maybe distributed or whatever it is suits at you. You can break it down easily because you can see each and every directory it's considering as a kind of layer, and each layer will be responsible for performing certain operation only. So there are no any kind of the cross boundary which is interfering each and other layer. So this is what we're going to cover today, right? So let's try to go ahead and write some code here. So I'm going to close everything for a while. Let's try to close it all. So first of all, what we're going to do, let's go ahead in the service directory. You can see we will be going to cover one by one all of the topics. So index.js, this is our entry where we have just registered our user routes. So if you go to user routes, here you can see we are just trying to register one route. This is which is going to help us to create one user for us, right? That is called potentially create user. And we're simply what we are doing, we're hooking up this the create user function from our controller, user controller. And what user controller will do, user controller responsibility is to validating all of the HTTP requests and responses, right? And it is going to hand it over all of the business logic stuff to our service. Let's say perform business logic and handing over to service, another service, let's say, right? So this store database is not going to be a part of this one, because why we are not going to be perform any database operations right there, because this the service layer, this is the user service layer. Let's say let's try to create one file here. This is going to be our user service.js, right? So here inside this user service.js, let's try to add some code very quickly, which is going to be accommodated as an example some of the things right there. We can say export const, right? Then let's say create user, right? Async maybe user data, right? And it is going to return something return maybe some response from here. Let's say any kind of response, right? So we will be going to decide some code right here. Maybe we are going to write some code which is going to be contact to some other service or maybe some other source of truth to perform the create user operation. But if you go here in the user controller, you can see we are simply creating the user by passing the request and the response, right? So which is potentially we have discussed replay is going to be our response, and we are going to capture whatever request is right there. That is we have capture right here, and we're just simply forming one input for performing that particular business operation, right? So as an example right now, let's set const response, right? So maybe response data, you can say response data will be await, right? then you can see we have our user service and create user. So where this user service is coming from exactly? So if you see here in the user controller, again, we have to import that particular thing, right? This user service or something, whatever. So let's try to import it. Import user service from user service, right? Now let's try to use that one, which is going to be await user service, then create user. So this is potentially it's going to be async, right? Then only we can just like call this await data. Then let's try to respond this one, respond data to our right here, right? So here we can check it out, like if we have response, right? Response data, right? Then only we are going to return like success response. Let's say success response. Success response, right? Otherwise we can just like throw handle error. Maybe we can handle the error. So this is the way we are going to our controller are going to talk to our services business logic layer. Then business logic layer responsibility is to move forward with the other stuff. And you can see right now we have some kind of response data, and our controller will not know like what kind of model or what kind of data exactly we will be going to our inside the user services being used. So that is what we are just trying to do right here. We just try to isolate our business logic, and we are not going to let the controller to error like what is going on inside right there. You need only data, right? You need only response. That is what we are going to give you, right? And the similar applies for routes. Route is not aware about what is going inside this create user. It's simply like what route is doing. Route is saying like we have received this endpoint. Let's try to map it with our controller to create user. So that's my responsibility. That's all. That is what route layer is like API layer is it's saying like that way, right? And similar per user controller. And now let's try to go ahead to the user service. So here we can see in the user service we have somehow our user data, but what this user data will do? We need to perform certain operation. We need to store the data somewhere, right? Let's say store the data in database, right? Then how our user service will store the data? So that's why we have created another layer that is called repository. Let's try to create another file here. This is going to be user repository.js, right? So here inside this user repository, let's try to create a couple of lines of code. So as an example, export const, right? So we can say get user, or maybe create. You can say create user, create user, right? And here will be this is going to be async, right? We can say this is going to be async. All right, so it is going to return some value from here as well as, right? So now while it comes to repository only know how to create the data. So here only it is going to be like create data in and the data store, right? Data store or database or source of truth, whatever you can say. So now let's go to our user service. Then user service, what we need to do, we need to implement somehow this repository as well. So let's try to import a repository. Let's say user repository from repository user repository. Then this user repository will be just like create like const user await user repository create user. This user, whatever response we'll be going to get it, let's try to return it back. All right, so now we can see like our user repository is responsible for creating our user, and it is giving back the data to the service, right? So from here we can directly get the data from here. So here maybe we can just like perform some business logic, all right? Maybe hashing a password, sending an email or something like that. This is what we are going to perform right here. So that means our user repository only here, it's only just like create the data store or handle, let's say you can say handle database error and provide a meaningful error message, right? Then because our users should not supposed to see what exactly in the granular level the errors happening in the database, right? So that is what we are going to handle in the database side in the repository. And user service is only going to be like handing over that the create user responsibility to a user repository. And right now you can see from the user repository, we'll be going to get that particular data, whatever expected from our user service. And we will perform some business logic and we'll be going to give the data back. So let's go to our user controller right now. So you can see like each and every layer has their own responsibility, right? They're performing something like that way and they're doing their own job and they're handing over the data, passing the data to another layer. And the similar way, it is just like, coming back the response from there, right? So now let's try to have a quick look here. You can see like, maybe we can just like, have a kind of quick arrow notation here. Our API layer, let's say, API layer, which is we are considering as a kind of like, routes, right? Routes. And we can say HTTP layer, which is we are just like, considering as a kind of what? We are considering as a form of, you can say like this, API layer, maybe we can consider as routes, all right? Then HTTP layer, right? Then this is going to be controller, which is potentially going to be give you the response to the routes. And then our business logic layer, right? Which is potentially, you can say service. Then our data layer, right? Data access layer, which is repository. And you can see like each and every layer, data is getting flow from the API to controller, right? To service, then repository, then again coming back from repository to service, service to controller, and controller to route. So you can see each and every layer, they are like, they are doing their job properly. So this is what exactly we will be going to try to achieve in throughout of our whole application. I think we have enough talk. So let's try to cover like all of these things together very quickly. Perfect. So now let's go ahead and add some features to our user service. But before that, let's try to handle our source of truth first. So go to our user repository. Here we have our create user. Let's try to create a couple of more functions. You can say get user. Let's say export get all users, right? Then we're not going to return anything. Let's say we return this kind of like empty object for a while. We will be going to cover very soon the database codes, whatever database we are going to integrate, that is we are going to hook it up right there. But just for accommodating our completely workflow, let's try to keep it like this way for a while. Then we're going to say get user by ID, right? Get user by ID. Here also we are simply just return empty object. And we will say export update user, then maybe delete user, right? So find user by email also perfectly fine, because anyway we are going to accommodate a login feature, right? So that is what we can do. This is perfect, and these are all good. So here in the user service, we have create user. Let's try to onboard rest of all. This is going to be export get all users, right? Simply we are going to call the repository get all user function, and we are going to return the data. Then maybe we can say get user by ID, then let's say update user, then delete user, and find user by email, right? Perfect. So now we have our find email by ID and we have everything here, right? So what we are going to do, let's go to our controller. So here also we are going to onboard a couple of more functions. This is create user. Then maybe we are going to say export const get users, all users, right? Request and reply. Then we're going to say, let's try to pick it up from our service, const result. Then we are going to say success response or handle error, or finally we are going to return the result, get all users. And similar, we are going to apply for our get user by ID also, and the same thing, right? Then update user also, we can say like, right? Then maybe delete user also. These are all perfect, right? Then maybe one more function, maybe we can accommodate. This is going to be our, let's say, export const user login, right? Request and reply, let's say. Okay, so here we're going to simply take the user email and password, and we're going to construct one user object right there, and we'll be going to pass to our user service. All right, so do we have the user login in user service? If you go to user service, I think, yeah, it's not be able to find it, because why? If you go to the user service here, let's go to our user service. Now here you can see in the user service, though we have implemented right there, but we don't have a kind of default export from there, right? So we are exported all of the function individually. So let's try to go ahead to the user controller. What we can say, the similar way we did for our user route, like import, star or all the import from our user controller, then user controller will have the access of all of the functions, just like we do for our user controller. The similar way we are going to do, like then we can say import all as user service. Now if you go to user service, if you click on this user login, then it has to be accessible. Let's say user, I think something is going wrong, so that means like we have not imported correctly. Let's go ahead and find it out. Here we can say go to our service, then go to our user service.js. Cool. Let's try to reload our the Visual Studio Code reload window. Then now it should have to give us like all of the things from here. Now you can see the go to the user service, it says like create user with the user data. So that means we should supposed to access this user from here, user service dot user login. Yes. Now let's go to our, let's provide the user here, and still not accessible. Why? Let's go to user service. I think the user service is there, like create user, create all user, user by ID, delete user, find by email. Can you see we don't have any function that is called user login, right? So that's why it is not be able to find it. So let's try to create one. This is going to be like find user by email. This is not required anymore. Or maybe we can just keep this one from the user service, but the purpose will be different because in the controller we are not going to execute any kind of business logic. So this is, maybe we can just rename it to something like this way, user login, right? Only inside the user login we need the user, where we need to find the user by email. So this is technically it's doing well. So now if we go to user controller, now we should supposed to find this user login from, right? Can you see it's user login is there. Now similar applies for our user service as well. As if you go to user service, if you see here in the repository, go to the repository, and we have all of the functions like we are exporting individually, right? So that means like this repository also you will not be able to find it out like from the create user, because of my ID it is giving all of this code sense the autocomplete, right? It's assuming like we have all of the functions can be existing right here. So that's why what we can do, we can say like something like this star, right? Import all as user repository. So to use this kind of convention, you need to make sure like you go to package.json file and you need to use the type as a kind of module. Otherwise you will not be able to import something like this, right? So that is, you need to keep in mind. So right now let's try to make sure like our path is correct. Here we can say go to one step further, go to repository and user repository.js, because we are writing ES modules code. That's why we need to define this .js extension also for our files, right? So now let's try to reload our Visual Studio Code once again. Now it should supposed to see all of the functions that is coming from our user repository. Can you see all of the functions are listed? So you can choose and you can go accordingly. So now here in the user routes, let's try to hook up rest of other stuff, right? So where we can say like Fastify get all users, right? Fastify get user by ID, or maybe edit user, delete user, and finally user login, right? And logout is not required. So these are the things we are going to cover. So now you can see if you go to the create user, and here what we are doing, we're constructing one object. That's really perfectly okay, right? So maybe this ID will be not required because that is, we are not interested anymore. So here we are going to validate our request, but this function in the controller, it is not responsible to do all of the stuff right here. So what we are going to do, as you remember, like in our Fastify section already, I have explained like how we are going to use the schema validation, JSON schema validation, that is inbuilt feature of the Fastify. So here, this is the right place where we are going to put our all of the schema validation, right? So where we can find it out something like this, let's say schema, we can have a body and we can have object and require name, email, and password, right? And property will be our name, will be our string, email will be our something like this, password will be something like this. And the similar applies like we are going to add the another stuff also, just for what our user create user will be going to return. That the schema also we are going to add it right there. Those stuff also we are going to cover in our next lecture. But in this lecture, let's try to cover at least bare minimum whatever we are trying to achieve. As an example, it should have to, while we're hitting this endpoint, it has to create at least user. Then while we're trying to get all of the users, then it has to provide return all of the user data from there. Then while we are going to perform all of the then while we're going to perform rest of other operations, it has to return the data accordingly. So here inside this create user, we will try to evaluate if we have any error, right? Fail it first, right? Rather than execute rest of other code. So that is the pattern we're going to follow whole application. So let's try to check it out. If we don't have any kind of response data right here, then we can say return or maybe replay status 4 or status 500, let's say 500 send, we can say internal server error and return. Perfect. So if we have any error, we are going to return from here, or if we have no any error, then we are going to return the success response from here. So let's go to our create user service. Perfect. So now here in the create user, you can see like, we need to do a couple of things. So right before storing the user, so here what we need to do, we need to hash our password first. Hash password. Then only like we can store the data. But we are going to cover those part also very quickly, because as a part of the process, we need to do a couple of more things right there. As an example, sending the email, right? So this part maybe we can just remove from here. So sending email, we will be follow event-driven programming as I showed you how we can achieve like without blocking the whole functionality, because we are not very much care about the feedback from our sending email will come from, right? So only we are going to trigger the send email, then we will be going to leave it right there. Then we will send to the user response kind of, hey, you have registered successfully. Very soon maybe you will receive a kind of email from our confirmation from us, right? So those are the things we are going to cover. But as a kind of minimalistic the user features, let's go to our repository to create user function. Here we are going to say, let's say user ID. This is going to be like you can say mock user details, right? You can say user ID will be 1, right? Then we can say the name will be John. Then maybe email will be, let's say, test, right? Test at test.com, right? So similar applies for, let's say, let's go to our other stuff also. Let's go to user. Then here we can say it's a form of array, right? Only one item, that's perfectly fine. And maybe let's try to remove this object. Yeah, this one, this is perfect. Then get user by ID, it's going to be like only one user, right? Then update user will be similar, just like we're going to return only one object. And delete user will be just like let's say true or false. True, let's say. And find user by email also, we're going to pass something like this. So here we are going to put our hands very quickly, where we will be going to integrate our database. But as of now, let's try to add some kind of mock data, because I'll be come back like why we have used this kind of mock data, or what will be the substitute when we need to test it out whole feature, right? That is also we're going to cover. That's a really very interesting topic, because we are writing our code very normal, very simple way, right? So this is the way, if we're going to write the code, then what can be what we can achieve and what we can improve. That part we're going to cover very soon. But let's try to stick with the plan. So as of now, we have all of the data that is fulfilling from our repository. That means like as soon as we are calling all of the function, it has to return at least something. So now let's go to our user controller. Let's check it out if we have hooked up everything correctly. Go and get all users, it's fine. Then user by ID, this is also fine, and seems everything is going well. Now let's try to go ahead here index.js and let's try to spin our application here. Now let's try to spin our application. So we are doing live coding, then error can be expected, right? So that's a kind of like you can say always trial and error. So what we can do, let's try to spin our application. This is going to be the yarn dev, right? Now you can see our server is spinning at port 9000. What we're going to do, let's try to open our request.http file. So here we're going to add a couple of routes. So let's try to remove all of these things from here maybe, right? So maybe we can keep the first one, then rest of all it's not required, right? So let's try to remove. So in this case, first let's try to create our user. So in this case, you can see the users will be our first route. If you see here in the user route, this is the route, right? And definitely it's not looks like good, right? So it has a lot. The whole user route has to be more cleaner than this, something like this. Let's say if you're going to remove this one, also our user routes has to be something like this, right? But this schema, as I said, we're going to move to a particular file where we can keep all of this schema validation and stuff. That is we are going to cover in our next lecture. But this lecture, we will try to just test it out all of these things if we are good to go with this or not. So first of all, this endpoint will be our users, right? Localhost 9000 will be our users. And post, what I'm gonna do, these are the 3 parameters are needed as a kind of required parameter. I'm gonna remove all of these things from here. Let's try to remove it, right? Now let's try to send a request. So our server is already spinning right here. Let's try to send a request. So as you can see, like it is sending some kind of error. Why? Because we have not added any kind of validation right here, right? So if you go to user routes and if you go here to the create user, we don't have any validation. Where this validation is coming from? This is what Fastify is so special. That's why we are going to use like the schema validation, JSON schema validation here. You can see like it is required an object. It says like body cannot be empty when content type is sent to a kind of application JSON. So now let's try to provide an object here, and we're intentionally going to remove this one of the property from here. Right, so let's try to save it, and now let's try to send the request. Now can you see the error request has been changed? Then it says body must have a required property name. So this is what exactly coming from here. You can see like if you see in the schema has a body and body type has to be object, right? And required property is name, email, and password. So if you remove the name from here, let's try to remove the name from here, right? Let's see. This one we can just like remove it from, let's say, from here, right? This is no more required property at all, right? Properties will be this one. Let's try to send a request once again. We're gonna say send request. Can you see it is returning back to the user object? Now let's go ahead and try to revert back to name, and here also we're going to provide the name. Right, so this is going to be name as a Zondo. And now if we send a request, it is fulfilling the same response. So that means if we're going to use this kind of schema validation right here in the Fastify in the route level, we no need to revalidate that specific request body right here inside the controller, right? Maybe we can validate something else. Let's say maybe our user should not supposed to exist, right? Because it's going to be, if already one user exists, then we cannot create this kind of validation. Maybe we can put it inside right there, or which is maybe potentially it's a part of like a job of our user service. So those are the stuff we are going to handle. Can you see this is really very wonderful feature for Fastify, right? So without installing any kind of third-party libraries, we can validate everything here. Now let's try to go ahead and experience the rest of other endpoints as well as. Now here in the request.http, let's try to get all of the users. Let's say users, right? So in this case, if we're going to send a request, you can see it is returning back, right? So now let's try to get the, you can say put request. Maybe put request we can provide right here. This is going to be put or pets. It's supposed to be pets, I think, right? No, put request. Okay, let's try to make it pets, because we don't want to replace everything from the user, right? We can say pets, right? Pets request, and let's try to send it. Okay, pets users is not available. So why? If you go to user routes, pets users.id. Okay, so we need to provide the user ID as well. So while we're going to call this pets request, right? So that here we need to provide any numbers of ID right there. Then it's gonna work. Now it is returning, right? The similar applies for the delete also. You can say like, maybe we can say here delete, then users right after that. You can just provide any kind of numbers right there. Let's try to send it, right? It says true. Perfect. Now here we're going to use the post, and this time let's try to remove this one because we need to test it out the login as well as, right? We have another route that's called login, users login, and in this case we're going to remove this name because only email and password will be needed. Let's try to send it. Now can you see this? It is returning back the data also. Cool. Then we have tested all of the endpoints correctly. It's a kind of normal flow. Everything will go correctly. But few things here. You can go ahead and maybe create the rest of other routes or as a controllers or anything like the same structure. Now let's try to think about what kind of problem it is happening right here, right? Maybe you can pause the video and think about it and compare your solution with me. So if you see here, let's go to index.js. You can see we are just creating one route here. We are just like simply passing the Fastify. If you go to user routes, and here we are not using any kind of dependencies, right? We are simply using the user controller. If you go to the user controller, let's go to user controller. You can see as soon as we are created the user controller, it is just to create our user service. So that means create user, there are no way to test the create user, right? If you need to test the create user, then what we need to do? We need to provide the user service. That is what we don't want, right? Maybe we need to test all of the validation logic, like whatever, not the request one, the rest of other validation logic right here inside this, the create user controller. Then how we can test it, right? There are no way. And if you go to our user service also, you can see like we have all of the functions that is related to our user service. But as soon as the user service, like this, any one of the functions going to be created, then we need to provide this user repository as well, as where we can provide, like there are no ways to provide this dependency, right? So that means you need to use this user repository, which is potentially it is pointing out to the database. So there are no way where we can just like directly pass the user repository as a kind of mock repository to test it out, right? So the first problem I can see, potentially, we cannot test the whole project right now. So to test the project, at least we should have to keep the usability of where we can pass the mock functionality. That is what we need to resolve. And second thing, can you see like each and every layer right now dependent to something like this user service, let's say, for the controller. And if you go to the service, user service, then it is dependent to user repository, right? So this function tightly coupled with this one. So that is what exactly the problem it is right now. So if we don't have the user repository, then this function will fail for sure. It's not going to serve the purpose, right? And if you see the index.js right here, we cannot test the whole application flow unless we are creating actual user service, we're creating actual repository, right? So there are no ways. So what we're going to do in the next lecture, we'll be going to introduce like dependency injection, and we will be going to refactor this code to a clean architecture, right? So where we will be going to learn how we can write some clean code, right, by using like singular responsibility, so we can test our code without depending on each and every layer. That is what we're going to cover, right? So I hope already, if you're watching our YouTube channel's video, there already we have added a couple of videos related to clean architecture and all in different programming languages, just like TypeScript maybe. And if you are curious, go ahead and watch it out right there. Then you can get a clue like how we can write such a kind of like functional programming or clean code. But nothing to worry. In this course also we're going to cover right there, and we will be going to convert all of the codes into the clean architecture way, so we can test it out each and every bit of the functionality. All right, then that's all for today. In the next lecture, we'll be going to implement the clean architecture with the solid principle. So where we will convert all of this code to a kind of standard functional programming code. Thank you. See you right.